Spartacus. The name conjures images of a noble, masculine gladiator fighting for freedom, the slave who became a symbol of liberation against tyranny. Hollywood made him a hero. History books call him a freedom fighter. But was that really what happened during the rebellion? Did Hollywood dig through Roman archives, or just run with a romanticized novel written 2 millennia after? It's a valid question, because ancient Rome did not see Spartacus as a hero. They described him as a cunning bandit leader, motivated by plunder rather than principles. A man who gathered an army not to free slaves, but to raid the richest countryside in the ancient world for his own benefit. Follow me back to 73 BCE, to the dust and heat of ancient Italy, where the scent of wild thyme mingles with the metallic tang of spilled blood in the Third Servile War, and see things from both sides of the story. We will search the shadowed cells of Capua's gladiator school and look beneath the marble of Roman triumphs, where trails of ash and rumour lie buried. If you're finding comfort in these ancient mysteries, do me a small favour and give this video a like and subscribe for more historical investigation that help you drift into sleep. I'm also curious where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there, so drop a comment and let me know. There's something magical about knowing we're all scattered across time zones, yet united in wondering about the same long-dead gladiator and the secrets he took to his unmarked grave. Now let's begin our journey back to the time of Spartacus' rebellion. The Italian countryside of 73 BCE stretches beneath morning mist, clinging to Mount Vesuvius volcanic slopes. The air carries the sweet smell of ripening grapes. Roman roads stretch like veins across the landscape, connecting villas, heavy with marble and gold, to the beating heart of the empire. In this world of 6 million free citizens and 2 million slaves, the tension hangs thick in the summer heat. In the town of Capua, where the amphitheater's shadow falls across cobbled streets, stands the ludus of Lentulus Batiatus, a gladiator school, though school is perhaps too gentle a word. It was a prison, a training ground, and a slaughterhouse rolled into one. Walking through its iron gates, one feels the weight of chains, hears the clash of wooden practice swords echoing off stone walls. This is where men are broken and remade into killers for the entertainment of Rome. Capua's location wasn't accidental. Strategically placed along the Via Appia, it sat close enough to Rome for swift transport of gladiators to major games, yet far enough to remain operationally isolated. This distance allowed the ludus to function with brutal efficiency, shielded from the political theatre of the capital. Rome could consume the spectacle without confronting its machinery. And this is where we first meet Spartacus. But who was he, really? Here's where the mystery begins, where the first cracks appear in everything we think we know. Even his origins are disputed, lost in the shadows between history and myth. Some whisper of noble blood, a connection to the royal Spartacid dynasty of Thrace. The name Spartacus itself means famous for his spear in the Thracian tongue. Perhaps he once rode across the windswept plains of his homeland, a prince among warriors, breathing the free air of the mountains. But the Roman sources tell a different story. They say he served Rome as an auxiliary soldier, fighting in the legions that carved empire from wilderness. He was young and strong, wielding a Thracian sickle sword in service to the very power that would one day enslave him. What happened next? Here the accounts split like a river dividing a round stone. Was he captured in battle, defending his homeland against Roman invasion? A warrior taken in honorable combat, dragged in chains from the smoking ruins of his village? Or was he, as the historian Florus claims, a deserter, a man who abandoned his post, turned his back on Rome, and fled to the hills to live as a bandit? The Romans are quite specific about this. They call him a deserter who became a robber before he became a slave. Consider what this means. If Spartacus was captured defending his people, then his later rebellion carries the weight of justice, the fire of a man reclaiming stolen freedom. But if he was a deserter turned bandit, then perhaps the Romans saw his true nature from the beginning. In the stifling heat of Capua's ludus, where the air tastes of sweat and iron, Spartacus found himself among walls carved with desperation. In the training yard, Men grunted and clashed with wooden weapons, their bodies marked by old scars and fresh bruises. Here, in these suffocating cells, Spartacus learned a different kind of warfare. They trained him in the Thracian style, the gladiator's version of his homeland's fighting traditions. Short sword and small round shield, quick movements and darting attacks. But more than weapons, he learned something else in these shadowed corridors. He learned to read men, to understand their fears and desires, to speak the language that desperate people understand. He was not alone in his captivity. With him was his wife, a Thracian prophetess whom the sources describe as subject to Dionysiac frenzy. In the flickering light of oil lamps, her eyes would roll back in divine madness, speaking in tongues while the other slaves gathered close. In the ancient world, prophecy was power, and those who could see the future commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Perhaps it was here, in these torchlit ceremonies, that Spartacus first discovered his gift for leadership. Not the leadership of noble birth or military rank, but something more primal. The ability to make desperate people believe in tomorrow. But what kind of tomorrow was he promising? Freedom, or simply a better class of slavery, where the slaves held the whips? In 73 BCE, as spring turned to summer, and the heat grew oppressive in the cells of Capua, 200 gladiators began to whisper of escape. The plan was simple, born of desperation and fed by hope. They would break free during the evening meal, when the guards were few and the weapons were stored in the armory. But plans have a way of unraveling, and secrets have a way of reaching the wrong ears. Someone talked. Someone always talks. The night before the planned escape, sandaled feet rustled on stone as whispered warnings passed from cell to cell. The plan is discovered. The escape is doomed before it begins. But Spartacus was not a man to accept doom quietly. When morning came and the betrayal was revealed, only 70 of the original 200 conspirators still had the courage to act. 70 men with nothing left to lose, facing a choice between certain death and impossible odds. They seized kitchen knives, cleavers, anything with an edge. In the chaos that followed, smoke filled the air and screams echoed through corridors that had seen so much death. But this time, the dying were guards, not gladiators. They fought their way to the armory, trading kitchen implements for proper gladiatorial weapons. The irony was not lost on them. They would escape using the very tools that had been meant to kill them in the arena. But escape to where? Rome controlled the roads, the ports, the mountain passes. Where could 70 runaway slaves hide in a world that wanted them dead? Spartacus had an answer: Mount Vesuvius. The great volcano loomed over the Campanian plain, its slopes covered in vineyards, and its crater filled with morning mist. To the Romans, it was just another mountain, but to a man who had once roamed the hills of Thrace, it was a fortress. As the sun set on their first day of freedom, the 70 survivors climbed the volcano's slopes, leaving behind the world of chains and sand for the uncertain promise of the heights. Behind them, word of their escape spread through Capua like wildfire. Ahead lay the dormant crater of Vesuvius, where vines grew thick and the morning brought new possibilities. But freedom, Spartacus would learn, was not won in a single night of blood and courage. Freedom had to be defended. Word of the gladiator escape reached Rome within days, carried by swift horses along the Via Appia. In the marble halls of the Senate, senators discussed the matter with the casual disdain reserved for minor inconveniences. 70 runaway slaves on a mountain, this was barely worth their attention. The task fell to Praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber, a Roman administrator more accustomed to collecting taxes than commanding armies. He gathered 3,000 militia, not the hardened legionaries who had conquered Gaul and trampled Germanic tribes, but citizen soldiers whose greatest military experience might have been drilling in the Campus Martius on quiet afternoons. To Glaber, the solution seemed obvious. Mount Vesuvius had one path down, and the rebels were trapped on its slopes like animals in a pen. All he had to do was block the exit and wait. Hunger would do what Roman steel apparently could not. The militia took their positions at the mountain's base, their bronze shields glinting in the Mediterranean sun. They set up a proper Roman camp, with neat rows of tents and cooking fires that sent smoke curling into the evening air. Glaber was confident. These were desperate slaves, after all, not soldiers. They would surrender within days, begging for the mercy of crucifixion rather than the slow agony of starvation. But high on the mountain slopes, among the twisted vines and volcanic rock, Spartacus was studying his enemies with the eyes of a man who had once served in Roman armies. He could see their weakness. They had blocked the obvious path, but mountains have many faces. The cliff face on the opposite side dropped away into a sheer ravine, too steep for any sane man to attempt, which was precisely why the Romans had left it unguarded. Spartacus gathered his men among the grapevines, their leaves rustling in the evening breeze. The vines were old and strong, their twisted stems thicker than a man's wrist. In the hands of gladiators who had learned to see weapons in kitchen knives, they became something else entirely. Working through the night, the rebels stripped the slopes of their longest vines, weaving them together into ropes. The work was silent, except for the whisper of leaves and the distant murmur of Roman voices from the camp below. By dawn, they had fashioned enough rope to reach the valley floor. As the sun rose over the Campanian plain, casting long shadows across the Roman camp, Spartacus led his men to the cliff's edge. Below them yawned a drop that would have made mountain goats reconsider. But these were men who had faced death every day in the arena, who had learned to calculate impossible odds and find the narrow path between survival and destruction. One by one, they rappelled down the vine ropes, their feet finding purchase on the volcanic rock. The descent was treacherous, each step a gamble against gravity and the strength of twisted grape stems. But they were fighting for more than life now. They were fighting for the right to choose their own deaths. By the time the Roman sentries spotted movement in the valley below, it was too late. Spartacus and his 70 had become ghosts, melting through the morning mist like shadows given form. The attack came from behind, where no attack should have been possible. Roman militia, comfortable in their certainty, found themselves facing gladiators who moved with the deadly precision of the arena. The camp erupted in chaos, bronze clashing against iron, disciplined formations dissolving into panicked flight. Glaber's militia broke like waves against rocks. These citizen soldiers, who had expected an easy victory over desperate slaves, found themselves overwhelmed by men who had been trained to kill for entertainment. The careful Roman camp became a scene of slaughter, tents collapsing in flame and blood. Praetor Glaber barely escaped with his life, vanishing into the countryside with the remnants of his force. Behind him, Spartacus stood amid the wreckage of a Roman camp, its order shattered, its pride trampled. But here, in this moment of triumph, the competing narratives begin to diverge like paths in a dark forest. The Roman sources are quite specific about what happened next. According to their accounts, Spartacus and his followers immediately began plundering the region surrounding Capua. They describe swift raids on villas and estates, the accumulation of wealth and weapons, the deliberate targeting of Roman property. But was this the behavior of desperate men seeking survival, or the true nature of a bandit finally revealed? Consider the practical reality. 70 men, armed with gladiatorial weapons, facing the wrath of Rome. They needed food, shelter, allies, and most importantly, they needed more weapons if they hoped to survive the legions that would surely follow. The villas of Campania offered all of these things. Rich estates worked by slaves who might join their cause, armories stocked with hunting weapons and old military gear, storehouses filled with grain and wine. From a purely military perspective, raiding these targets made perfect sense. Yet the Roman sources emphasize not just the practical aspects of these raids, but their focus on wealth. They describe the rebels dividing spoils, trading captured goods for better weapons, accumulating treasure like successful bandits. Was Spartacus a pragmatic military commander securing resources for his growing army? Or was he, as the Romans claimed, revealing his true nature, as a criminal opportunist who had found the perfect cover for large-scale robbery. The question becomes more troubling when you consider how efficiently his operation functioned. The raids were not random acts of desperate violence, but carefully planned strikes that maximized gain while minimized risk. Someone was thinking strategically about profit and loss, about spoils and survival. Someone who understood, perhaps, that in a world where men were property, the only meaningful freedom was the freedom to take what you wanted from those who had taken everything from you. But even in that first moment of victory over Glaber's militia, as smoke rose from the Roman camp and eagles lay trampled in the volcanic soil, the question remained: were they freedom fighters beginning a noble quest, or were they, as the Romans would insist, bandits who had just discovered a land rich in resources and ripe for rebellion? The answer might lie in what they did next, an act that would shake the Roman Republic to its foundations. Winter descended on the Italian countryside like a shroud, bringing with it the sharp winds that swept down from the mountains and the bitter rains that turned Roman roads to mud. But in the villas and estates surrounding Mount Vesuvius, something else was spreading through the cold air. Word of the gladiators' victory over Praetor Glaber. Slaves working in the olive groves heard it first, whispered between the twisted trees as they gathered the harvest. Kitchen servants caught fragments of conversation carried on the wind from their masters' dining rooms. Shepherds on distant hillsides saw the smoke and heard the stories from traders on the roads. 70 slaves had defeated 3,000 Romans. The impossible had become fact. As winter deepened into 72 BCE, they began to come. At first, just a few. A household slave who vanished in the night, leaving behind only an empty chain. A shepherd who drove his flock toward Vesuvius and never returned. Field hands who walked away from the latifundia, abandoning the endless rows of grain for the uncertain promise of freedom. But as word spread, the trickle became a stream, and the stream became a flood. They came from the great estates of Campania, where slaves worked the volcanic soil that had made their masters rich. They came from the silver mines of Lucania, where men descended into darkness, each dawn wondering if they would see the sun again. They came from the shipbuilding yards of Bruttium, where skilled craftsmen labored under the constant threat of the lash. And they were not alone. The Roman sources are clear about this detail, though they mention it with obvious discomfort. The rebellion attracted not just slaves, but also free men, shepherds whose flocks had been seized for taxes, farmers whose lands had been absorbed by the great estates, poor citizens crushed by debt and desperate for any chance to reclaim what they had lost. By early 72 BCE, Spartacus commanded an army of 70,000 to 120,000 followers, from 70 gladiators to a force larger than most Roman legions, gathered in the space of a few months. But what kind of leader was attracting this multitude? Here the Roman historians provide details that seem almost reluctant, as if acknowledging virtues in an enemy made their own defeat more shameful. Plutarch, writing more than a century later, describes Spartacus as more Greek than Thracian, exceptionally intelligent and cultured. These are not the words typically used to describe bandits or criminals. They suggest sophistication, education, perhaps even nobility of character. Appian adds another crucial detail. Spartacus divided the spoils in equal shares. His numbers quickly swelled. Think about what this means. In a world where most armies operated on the principle that commanders took the lion's share, while common soldiers fought for scraps, Spartacus was offering something revolutionary: equality. But was this genuine principle, or simply smart recruitment tactics? Consider the alternative interpretation. What better way to build a bandit army than to offer equal shares of the plunder? Pirates and brigands had used similar methods for centuries to maintain loyalty among desperate men. Give everyone a stake in the robbery, and you ensure their continued cooperation. Yet if Spartacus was merely a bandit leader, why did Roman sources emphasize his intelligence and culture? Why acknowledge his fairness in dividing spoils? Rome had every reason to portray him as a savage criminal, a monster whose defeat would bring glory to Roman arms. Instead, they paint a picture of a complex figure whose methods suggested both strategic brilliance and genuine leadership ability. Someone who could unite not just desperate slaves, but free men who had other choices available to them. The rebellion's early successes only deepened the mystery. Through the winter and spring of 72 BCE, Spartacus defeated praetor after praetor. Each victory brought more followers, more weapons, more wealth. The Roman sources focus consistently on these material gains, the plundering of estates and villas, the trading of spoils for bronze and iron to forge better weapons. But they also record something else. The rebellion was becoming organized. Supply lines were established. Scouts ranged far ahead of the main force. Alliances were forged with merchants willing to trade with the rebels. This was not the chaotic rampage of desperate slaves, but the methodical campaign of someone who understood warfare. In the rebel camps, discipline was enforced with surprising rigor. Gladiators trained new recruits in formations and weapon handling. Scouts returned with maps scratched into bark and warnings whispered over campfires. Disputes over spoils were settled not by brute force, but by a council of veteran fighters. This was not a mob. It was becoming an army. Was this the work of a revolutionary leader building an army to challenge the slave system itself? Or was it a bandit leader using military discipline to maximize profits from the richest territory in the Roman world? The question became more pressing when the rebellion faced its first major division. Early in 72 BCE, a Gallic gladiator named Crixus broke away from Spartacus, taking 30,000 followers with him to raid southern Italy. The Roman sources interpret this split as revealing the true nature of both leaders. They suggest that Crixus represented the purely criminal element, interested only in immediate plunder and destruction. Spartacus, by contrast, had larger ambitions, though the exact nature of those ambitions remained unclear. But consider another possibility. Perhaps both leaders were opportunists, differing only in their assessment of risk and reward. Crixus might have preferred the immediate gratification of raiding wealthy southern estates. Spartacus might have calculated that continued warfare offered better long-term prospects for accumulating wealth and power. From this perspective, the split was not between noble revolutionary and greedy criminal, but between two different approaches to the same fundamentally criminal enterprise. The split was not quiet. Roman sources are silent on the moment, but imagine the tension. Crixus, proud and impulsive, arguing for swift raids and vengeance. Spartacus, calculating, urging restraint and preparation. No records survive of their final words. But Spartacus did not stop Crixus and his followers from going south. And south they went. The spring air of 72 BCE carries the scent of mountain snow, as Spartacus leads his army north toward the Alps. Behind him, the smoke of victory still rises from scattered Roman camps. The consular legions of Gellius and Lentulus lie broken in his wake, their eagles captured, their commanders fled. Even with Crixus and 30,000 followers gone south, Spartacus's army remains formidable. They press toward the Alpine passes and freedom. The split that might have crippled another army has barely slowed his march. But for Crixus and the men who followed him, the situation literally went south. At Mount Garganus, Roman forces surrounded and slaughtered his entire force. The Roman sources report his fate with grim satisfaction. 30,000 dead, no survivors. News of Crixus' death reached Spartacus mid-March, whether by fleeing survivors or intercepted Roman dispatches. No one can say. The loss was staggering, but Spartacus's army had already swollen beyond anything Rome thought possible. Germanic tribesmen marched alongside remaining Gallic warriors. Former shepherds carried shields stripped from defeated praetors. The very slaves who once worked the vineyards of Vesuvius now commanded battalions. 70,000 followers, maybe more, their voices echoing off the mountain slopes in a dozen languages. But something extraordinary happens here. something that changes how we understand everything about Spartacus, something that makes you wonder if Rome's version of his story might have been more accurate than we want to believe. He stands at the threshold of freedom. The Alps ahead, the open road rising toward distant homelands. The mountain wind carries no sound. No pursuit, just the distant call of birds and the rustle of armor as his army waits. Some begin to celebrate. Others scout the passes. The Alps are open. The way home is clear. And yet, in this moment of possibility, he turns back. For months, Spartacus had fought his way across Italy. He had defeated after consul, seized enough wealth to buy his freedom many times over. The mountain passes lay open before him, leading to Gaul, to Germania, to any homeland his followers desire. Roman pursuit lies days behind, and he chooses to wheel his entire army south, back into the heart of Roman territory. Why? The Roman historian Plutarch offers one explanation. He writes that Spartacus wanted to cross the Alps, wanted to scatter his army to their homelands where Rome could never follow. But his men, drunk on victory and plunder, refused to leave Italy. They had grown wealthy beyond their dreams. Why abandon such profitable hunting grounds? But Appian tells a different story. He suggests Spartacus himself harbored greater ambitions, that in those quiet moments overlooking the Roman countryside, the former gladiator began to dream of marching on Rome itself, of bringing the empire to its knees. There's a third possibility, one that rarely appears in dramatizations, but lingers in the margins of Roman accounts. Some scholars believe Spartacus' army operated by consensus, that major decisions, including whether to cross the Alps, were put to a vote. If true, then Spartacus may have been overruled by his own followers, swept along by the will of a force he could no longer fully command. Was this democracy in action, or the beginning of a fatal drift? Listen to the silence between these accounts. Neither Roman historian suggests this decision came from noble motives. No mention of liberating slaves across the empire. No grand speeches about ending the institution of slavery forever. Just the cold calculation of a successful bandit leader, deciding whether to quit while ahead or double down on the greatest raid in Roman history. The archaeological evidence whispers its own clues. At campsites along their route south, excavations reveal continued focus on plunder and trade. Bronze and iron stockpiled for weapons, luxury goods divided among the ranks. The organizational structure of an army built for profit, not revolution. Consider what the Gallic and Germanic followers must have thought. For them, the Alps meant going home, back to their tribes, their families, their freedom. Yet they followed Spartacus south into certain death. Were they convinced, or simply caught up in the momentum of a leader whose true nature they had never fully understood? By summer, Spartacus has seized the wealthy port city of Thrace. Roman sources describe the same pattern that followed him from Capua. Immediate plundering of the surrounding region, trading captured goods for bronze and iron, building a war machine designed not for liberation, but for continued warfare. And here, in the heat of a southern Italian summer, we see something that chills the blood. Appian records that Spartacus crucified a Roman prisoner as a warning to his own troops, the former slave adopting the cruelest punishment of his former masters, the man who had felt the bite of Roman chains, now wielding them against others. Was this the harsh justice of a revolutionary leader maintaining discipline, or the casual brutality of a bandit chief who had always understood that violence was simply another tool? The Roman historian Florus adds another detail that echoes through the centuries. Spartacus held gladiatorial funeral games for his fallen officers. Think about this, a man who had fought for his life in the arena, now forcing other men to do the same for his entertainment. The slave become master, adopting every custom of those he claimed to despise. The Alpine decision reveals something else troubling. If Spartacus truly sought to end slavery, why not declare it? Why not issue proclamations calling slaves across the empire to rise? Why not attempt to build lasting institutions, establish laws, create something beyond the temporary chaos of rebellion. Instead, we see the actions of a brilliant opportunist, someone who understood that the appearance of noble purpose could recruit followers, but whose real focus remained on immediate, tangible gains. The Roman sources consistently emphasize his distribution of spoils, his trading networks, his focus on material wealth, not because they wanted to diminish him, but because that's what their informants witnessed. The summer heat of southern Italy presses down on Spartacus and his army as they consolidate their position around Thracian. The Alpine opportunity has passed. The decision has been made. There will be no easy escape, no quiet dispersal to distant homelands. But what drives a man to choose certain conflict over probable freedom? What calculations run through the mind of someone who has tasted both slavery and victory? The missing voices haunt this moment. What did his Thracian wife prophesy in her torchlit ceremonies? What songs did the Germanic warriors sing around their campfires? What debates raged in councils of war as winter approached? We know only what Rome chose to preserve. And what Rome preserved was the image of a capable but ultimately criminal leader, whose greatest mistake was believing his own success would last forever. The Alpine decision remains the key to understanding Spartacus. Everything else, every noble speech Hollywood puts in his mouth, every revolutionary ideal modern historians attribute to him, must explain this single, crucial choice. Why turn back when freedom lay ahead? No record survives of Spartacus' own explanation for this crucial choice, leaving us to wonder whether we've been celebrating a hero or romanticizing history's most successful bandit. The news reaches Rome like a shock through marble halls. Spartacus has turned back from the Alps. The rebellion that should have dissolved into the mountains now threatens the heart of the empire. In the Forum, senators who had dismissed the revolt as mere banditry suddenly face a terrifying reality. This is no longer a problem for provincial governors. Marcus Licinius Crassus steps forward, the richest man in Rome, he who made his fortune buying burning buildings and the property of the proscribed. 8 legions, 40,000 professional soldiers, Rome's answer to a crisis that has spiraled beyond all control. Crassus understands what his predecessors missed. This is not a slave revolt to be suppressed with casual brutality. This is war, and war requires the tools of war. He revives decimation, the ancient punishment where every 10th man in a cowardly unit is beaten to death by his comrades. Roman discipline will match rebel desperation. In the furnace heat of late 72 BCE, 2 forces begin a deadly dance across southern Italy. Spartacus, his army still massive despite the loss of Crixus, seeks to avoid direct confrontation. Crassus builds something unprecedented, a wall. 24 miles of stone and timber stretching across the narrow peninsula, sealing Spartacus into the toe of Italy like a cork in a bottle. Archaeological teams have found traces of this wall. Massive earthworks, defensive ditches, the skeletal remains of the most expensive hunting trap ever built. Crassus spent his own fortune to cage the most dangerous prey in Roman history. But Spartacus had always been cunning. On a night when winter storms lashed the coast, driving salt spray inland and turning the ground to mud, when Crassus' sentries huddled around sputtering fires, the rebels struck. They filled a section of the ditch with earth and fascines, scaled the wall in darkness, and broke free into the wider peninsula. The trap had failed. It should have been the moment of escape, the moment when superior tactics and timing opened the road to freedom. Instead, Spartacus makes another choice that reveals the complexity of his true nature. He turns toward Sicily, the largest island in the Mediterranean, home to vast slave plantations, hundreds of thousands of potential recruits, and separated from Italy by the narrow Strait of Messina, barely 2 miles of choppy water. Roman sources describe his negotiations with Cilician pirates. These were the same sea wolves who had once kidnapped Julius Caesar, who controlled the shipping lanes of the eastern Mediterranean. For a man seeking to expand his rebellion, they offered the only path across the water. The deal was struck, payment rendered. The pirates took Spartacus gold and silver, the clink of coins echoing across the water as they loaded it onto their ships and sailed away into the pre-dawn darkness. No transport, no crossing, just the bitter lesson that even successful bandits could be betrayed by fellow criminals. Was this the desperate gamble of a revolutionary seeking to spread liberation across the empire, or the final miscalculation of a raider who had finally overreached? Trapped in the narrow confines of southern Italy, with winter closing in and Crassus' legions tightening the noose, Spartacus faced his final choice. Surrender was not an option. Crucifixion awaited every captured rebel. Flight was impossible. The sea had been closed to them. Only battle remained. The sources disagree on the exact location, but somewhere in the hills of southern Italy, in the early months of 71 BCE, the two armies met. Professional Roman legions, their shields locked, their pilums ready, facing the desperate courage of men who had nothing left to lose. Plutarch records that Spartacus fought most bravely in the front rank. Even his enemies acknowledged his courage. He killed his own horse before the battle, declaring that if he won, he would have plenty of Roman horses to choose from. If he lost, he would need no horse at all. Think about this moment. A man who had been property, who had fought for other men's entertainment, now commanding the center of a battle line, his Thracian war cry echoing across the field as he charged toward the Roman standards. Whether bandit or revolutionary, he chose to die as a warrior. But here's where the story takes its strangest turn. When the dust settled and the Roman victory was complete, when 6,000 rebels hung crucified along the Appian Way as a warning to future generations, one thing was missing: Spartacus' body. Roman soldiers moved through the battlefield as twilight fell, turning over corpses by torchlight, checking faces bloated by death and combat. They knew their prize, the Thracian's distinctive features, his battle scars. But among the thousands of dead, he was nowhere to be found. Appian writes that his body was never identified despite a thorough search of the battlefield. Plutarch confirms the death, but notes the failure to find the corpse. For Romans who loved to display the heads of their enemies, who paraded conquered kings through the streets of Rome, this was unprecedented. The man who had terrorized Italy for 2 years simply vanished into the chaos of his final battle. Did he escape in the confusion, wounded but alive? Was his body so mutilated by combat that identification became impossible? Did his followers hide it to prevent Roman desecration? The missing corpse adds one final mystery to a life full of them. The bandit leader, or freedom fighter, who defied every expectation, whose true motives died with him on an unnamed hillside in southern Italy. 6,000 crosses stretched along the road from Capua to Rome, wood creaking under the weight of the dead, the stench of decay following travelers for 100 miles, 50 meters between each one. 100 miles of crucified flesh rotting under the Italian sun. Rome's message could not have been clearer. This is what happens to those who challenge the natural order. But whose natural order? The system that made some men property and others masters, or the older law that made successful violence its own justification? The rebellion was over. The slaves were dead. The empire was safe. But the questions Spartacus raised, whether he meant to or not, would outlive every cross along that bloody road. The silence is what haunts us most. In all the scrolls and histories, in all the marble inscriptions celebrating Roman victory, one voice is completely absent. Spartacus himself never speaks. We have no record of his speeches to his followers, no manifestos declaring his goals, no letters to Roman officials demanding terms. No dying words on that nameless battlefield. The man who shook the Roman Empire for 2 years left behind no explanation of why he did it. This silence wasn't accidental. Roman law was clear. Slaves had no legal right to record their stories. They couldn't own property, couldn't testify in court, couldn't leave written accounts of their experiences. Their voices existed only in the moment, lost forever when their lips fell silent. His wife, the Thracian prophetess who saw visions in torchlit ceremonies, who may have shaped his destiny with her prophecies. Her words vanished with the smoke of her sacred fires. The songs the Germanic warriors sang around their campfires, the debates that raged in councils of war, the private conversations between husband and wife as they planned their desperate gamble, all erased by the simple fact that slaves were not considered fully human enough to have stories worth preserving. What survived were the accounts written a century later by Roman aristocrats. Plutarch, writing for Greek intellectuals; Appian, chronicling civil wars for educated Romans; Florus, crafting dramatic episodes for imperial audiences. Each shaped their version of Spartacus to serve their own purposes, their own understanding of what the rebellion meant. But for 1700 years, the Romans controlled the narrative. Spartacus was remembered as they described him, a capable military leader, certainly, but ultimately a bandit whose threat to the social order justified his brutal suppression. A cautionary tale about the dangers of letting slaves believe they could be more than property. Then, in 1760, everything changed. In theatres of Paris, French playwright Bernard Joseph Saurin premiered a tragedy called Spartacus. Gone was the opportunistic bandit leader. In his place stood a noble freedom fighter, a man driven by love of liberty and hatred of oppression. The French audiences, living under their own absolute monarchy, saw in this reimagined Spartacus a hero for their own age. When revolution erupted in 1792, Saurin's play returned to the stage with explosive power. Spartacus became a symbol of resistance against tyranny. His story spread across Europe, inspiring republicans and revolutionaries who found in the gladiators' rebellion a mirror of their own struggles against kings and emperors. By the 1800s, statues of Spartacus appeared in public squares. Karl Marx hailed Spartacus as the most splendid figure in ancient history, a rebel who refused to compromise with oppression. Later Marxist thinkers embraced him as a prototype of class resistance. The bandit Rome feared had become the revolutionary icon the world remembered. 1960 brought Stanley Kubrick's film, cementing in popular imagination the image of Spartacus as a Christ-like figure dying for the sins of slavery. Hollywood's version became history for millions of viewers who never read Plutarch or Appian. The noble gladiator fighting for freedom became the definitive truth. But here's what's remarkable about the Roman sources. They had every reason to lie about Spartacus, and yet their accounts contain surprising admissions. They could have made him a monster, a savage barbarian whose cruelty justified any brutality in response. Instead, they acknowledge his intelligence, his military skill, his ability to inspire loyalty. Plutarch calls him more Greek than Thracian, and exceptionally intelligent and cultured. Why preserve these details if the goal was simply to demonize him? Across all the different Roman authors, Plutarch, Appian, Florus, the same themes emerge. His intelligence, his fair division of spoils, his courage in battle, his focus on plunder and material rewards. If they were fabricating evidence to serve imperial propaganda, why not simply make him a pure villain? The contradictions suggest something more complex, perhaps the grudging admission that their greatest enemy possessed qualities they couldn't entirely deny, even as they worked to contain the revolutionary implications of his success. Yet Rome also had powerful reasons to distort the truth. The empire's foundation rested on slave labor. 2 million slaves supporting 6 million free citizens. Rome could never afford to acknowledge that a slave might have legitimate grievances, might represent something more dangerous than criminal opportunism. The economic system demanded that slaves remain property, not potential revolutionaries with valid causes. More troubling for Roman propaganda, Spartacus had proven that slaves could organize sophisticated resistance, could outfight professional legions, could inspire loyalty across ethnic and cultural boundaries. Acknowledging this level of capability among the enslaved population threatened the very logic of slavery itself. Better to frame him as an opportunistic bandit than admit he might represent the military and political potential of every slave in the empire. The Roman writers may have been more honest than we give them credit for, even as they shaped their accounts to serve imperial needs. Their consistent focus on plunder and material motivations might reflect what their sources actually witnessed, filtered through the lens of writers who could never quite bring themselves to acknowledge the full implications of what Spartacus had achieved. Throughout this investigation, we've encountered evidence that resists simple explanations. Let's examine the key moments that reveal why Spartacus defies easy categorization. The Alpine decision haunts every theory about Spartacus. Everything else hangs on that single moment when freedom stretched ahead and he chose to turn back. He stands on those mountain slopes in the spring of 72 BCE. Below, the fertile plains of northern Italy shimmer in morning light. Behind him, the passes lead to Gaul, to Germania, to home territories where many of his followers were born. The Roman legions are scattered, still reeling from their defeats. Escape is certain, but ahead lies something else. The heart of the empire. Villas heavy with gold, cities ripe for plunder, the chance to prove that Rome itself isn't untouchable. His army looks to him, 70,000 followers who have tasted victory and found it sweet. What goes through his mind in that moment? We'll never know. The man who made that choice left no diary, no letters, no speeches explaining his reasoning. The Alpine decision remains locked in silence, and with it, the truth about who Spartacus really was. What we can say with certainty: he united followers from across the Mediterranean world for 2 years of impossible victories. He used both brutal pragmatism and strategic mercy. He made decisions suggesting complexity beyond simple categories, achieving something unprecedented in Roman history. The evidence supports competing interpretations. Roman sources emphasize plunder and opportunism. Modern revolutionary readings see a freedom fighter who understood that individual escape meant nothing if the system remained intact. Pragmatic explanations recognize that armies develop their own momentum, their own hungers. Modern scholarship leans toward the Roman view, but those same sources contain contradictions. Why acknowledge his intelligence if the goal was demonization? Why preserve accounts of his fair treatment of followers? Perhaps the truth lies between all interpretations. Maybe he began, as sources suggest, motivated by survival and wealth, but discovered larger possibilities through proving slaves could be generals. Or perhaps someone whose true motivations died with his missing body on that nameless battlefield. The missing body became its own answer. Roman generals displayed defeated enemies as trophies. Spartacus vanished, leaving only questions. Maybe the most dangerous thing about Spartacus was simpler than his tactics. In a world where some humans were legally property, he insisted on being fully human. Whether bandit or revolutionary, he proved slaves could be more than Rome imagined. The questions he raised outlived every cross along the Appian Way. His story becomes whatever each generation needs. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones we almost forgot to tell. Did Rome lie about Spartacus? Did France create a myth? Maybe the better question is which version serves human dignity, which story reminds us that no person is naturally property of another. The man who shook the Roman Empire remains what he was in life, fully human, impossibly complex, and free to be interpreted by anyone brave enough to follow him into the mystery of choosing between safety and something larger than ourselves.